Okay, so here I am at lecture number 8.3, Army Medicine. And let's start with a little clip here from Robert Altman's MASH, which is a filming of Richard Hooker's book, MASH. And remember that MASH is a MASH unit is a mobile Army surgical hospital. The first MASH units, the idea is to have forward care, so you get as close to the line as you can, so that you can get soldiers in as quickly as possible. The idea being that if you can treat them more quickly, you can get them back in the line more quickly, which was the idea. Increasingly, what happened was that it was clear that these people weren't going back. They weren't going to go back. They were being saved, but the wounds were so bad that people were just, that was it. They were invalided out, as they called it. So here's a little clip from that, and this is Robert Altman, the great Robert Altman, who's a genius director, from his film MASH in 1970. Okay, so we'll watch this.
Keep it clean.
Yeah, I can tie that for you. Okay, let's have the big stitches for closing up the chest.
Fine.
Larger needles, Malcolm.
No, sutures. Start down here, then. Like it needs another one, huh? It's tough.
Anybody know if this is an officer or an enlisted man?
He's an enlisted man.
Make the stitches big.
Okay, so the discussion here is the major fight here is basically the class war, that the officers are supposed to get one kind of medicine and the men are supposed to get another. Now, obviously, everybody's supposed to get the same kind of treatment, but that's not what actually happened. And this book and the movie that comes out of it shows that the officers are given preferential treatment, that black soldiers are discriminated against, and so on. Now, remember that this war that is under discussion in MASH is the Korean War, but it looks like Vietnam. And so what Altman did in 1970, and this produced a very long-running television show. They always said, the television show ran longer than the war. That's not actually true, but because depending on the way you count, many of us consider that the Vietnam War starts for America in 1950 and runs to 1975. So it's essentially a 25-year-long war. It depends on what you consider involvement to be. So that's another one of those, fights that people have. They're pretty much pointless, but anyway. But the point about this particular clip is that it's a class war, and it's also a race war. And you see that, where you've got these, and you get doctors who have politics. And this is something that we saw with Michael Hare's doctor, who says, he refuses to treat the Vietnamese, and Hare says to him, but you took the Hippocratic Oath. He's like, took it in America, right? So, stories about combat that come out during the Vietnam War were familiar to soldiers, but they were often hushed up at home. And so, one of the great myths of the battlefield is that the enemy kills you, your own forces don't kill you. It was during the Vietnam War, actually, that this changed. And it changed because of a very famous case that was covered by C.D.B. Bryan in a book called Friendly Fire. And in the book, husband and wife are trying to find out how their son was killed in Vietnam. And they're given one story after another, and they persist in asking, no, we want to know, what actually happened to our son? How did our son get killed? And what they finally find out is that the son was killed by friendly fire, which means that, which happens all the time, actually. It happened a great deal in World War I, and it happened a great deal in World War II. In other words, your own people kill you, because there's an artillery mission, let's say, and you're in the field, and they get the grid coordinates wrong, so they drop shells on you and kill your friends, or there are planes that are flying over, and they strafe your position instead of strafing the other position, which means to hit with rocket fire and machine guns, or they drop bombs where they're not supposed to, or they drop napalm on you, or they hit you with Agent Orange, which will kill you more slowly. There's all kinds of reasons, or that there are people behind you, who are coming up behind you in support, and somebody panics and fires their gun and, kills a bunch of guys, or troops. And this happens famously again in Afghanistan, actually, with a famous football player who was considered to be a real hero, and he joined up and so on, and then he was killed by friendly fire, which is good because it shined a light. I mean, I'm sorry he was killed, but it shined a light on the fact that this was, was an ongoing process. In war games, typically, all countries war game, and I talked about this. Remember I was talking about the Kriegspiel, which is the literal translation of war game. It's German. But the war games have become very sophisticated, and they're modeled by computer, and then they actually go out and fight these war games. And so they'll have the Navy will have war games out in the ocean, and a number of nations will participate. So NATO-aligned nations may get into on the Pacific Rim, let's say. You get a bunch of navies together, and everybody participates, and so they play different roles. And there's Pro-4 and Op-4, and Pro-4 is usually the good guys, the allies, and Op-4 are the opposing forces, right? Pro-4 tends to be blue, and Op-4 tends to be red in the Western world, and this comes from the old days of fighting the communists, basically. So the enemy was red; they were evil. The evil red, the Red Menace. So why am I telling you about these colors? Because if you read about something and they say it was a blue-on-blue incident, it means that Pro-4 dropped bombs or weapons of some kind on Pro-4 forces, blue on blue. Blue on red, that's the way it's supposed to be. Red on blue, fine, enemies. But red on red or blue on blue, these are friendly fire incidents where you kill your own people. And as I say, not intentionally, usually. So this concept of friendly fire was well known in World War II. It just wasn't talked about at home. Nobody talked about it because it was like, shit, we screwed up. So there is a powerful myth that such things don't occur, and we still have this myth, and you can see how much we have it, and the sanctity of this myth is very clear in the story of, and I was talking about this football player, Pat Tillman, who was the famous rebel safety for the Arizona Cardinals, who gave up a $3.6 million contract to go and fight with the Rangers in Afghanistan, and was eventually killed by the Americans by being shot in his back, as far as we can tell. We don't really know. They've gone through, I'm trying to think, I think they've had now 11 inquiries into Tillman's death. And the more inquiries that they have, the less it's clear. The parents still don't know. It was a very public, highly publicized death. The first thing that they did was the military came up with in a heroic gun battle, Pat Tillman was shot down by the Taliban, blah, blah, blah. And they gave him a medal and all of that. And the family was like, well, tell us more about this battle. And they were like, well, we can't tell you about the battle because, of course, there wasn't one. And then that story fell apart, and then they began pushing it for more information. And, of course, there was no more information. Then it turned out, oh, wait a second, actually, another unit had opened up on Tillman's unit, and they'd shot them in one of these passes. I don't mean a football pass. I mean a pass in Afghanistan. So it was Vietnam that made public the blue-on-blue incidents. Have a look at the Pat Tillman issue if you want to see basically about this. To date, I have some numbers here. To date, the Department of Defense has run 6 investigations, several inquiries, and there have been 2 congressional inquiries. So total, yeah, 11. That's what I remembered.